Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that encourages you to hands, face, space, get a taste of this delicious eat out to help out meal deal. I take it you're well. Have you been going out for a meal deal on the government? I think that started today, didn't it?
I haven't yet. No, I haven't got anything planned yet. But as we're going to discuss in our upcoming bits, there's a reason why I probably won't be doing it anytime soon. But it's been very interesting. I had to bring that up because the actual phrase the government is using is hands, face, space, get a test.
I see.
Which doesn't rhyme. And I always say it should be get a taste. But a taste of what? Because you don't want to be licking door handles in this situation. So,
no,
yeah.
Definitely not.
So I that's just a suggestion. If Boris is listening, or Rishi, if they want to take a little suggestion, that's how you can mould your two opposing agendas into one, useful phrase. And it still rhymes, mostly.
Kind of a hard, yeah. We have a rhyme up to a point. So let's go into our kind of headlines. From the Times, Prime Minister slams brake on easing of lockdown. So I think there's actually quite a few things we need to talk about here. It's all been, like with everything in this pandemic, it's been quite fast, the pace of updates in the last week. Various things happening, the left hand not talking to the right hand, all the kind of things we've touched on before. I suppose maybe you want to talk to this kind of, it's not hypocrisy necessarily, but so on one side, the government is trying to get everything reopened and stimulate the economy. But on the other hand, we still have to understand that if there's a spike in cases, if other things happen, we need to suddenly close things down again. But there's been a few missteps, I feel, in how that's been handled.
Yeah, no, it's been 3 weeks since we last spoke, and a lot has happened in that time. And I think one of the big feelings in the country in general has been, just from people around me and seeing what other people are doing online and social bubbles. I'm seeing a lot of people going to Cornwall on holiday. It appears that people have relaxed slightly, and that might be in tune with the message from the government in the recent weeks that now is the time to get back to normal. I don't know if you've seen those adverts on Twitter that kind of say, get out and enjoy your summer, essentially, is what they, now's the time to get back out there, but do it within social distancing rules. There seemed like be a quite soft push from the government to say, things are getting back to normal. We need to get out of this lockdown mindset and start thinking, right, let's go out and, go back to pubs. We talked about pubs reopening. Now we've got gyms and beauty salons reopening. We even, one of the things that caught my eye, at least, was there have been trial events of bringing crowds back at sporting events, most notably the cricket. So me as an avid cricket supporter, and I've watched a county championship game, even before the pandemic, you could easily socially distance because it was about one man and his dog watching from the sidelines with lots of gaps in between. So cricket was kind of like one of the perfect sports to get there and trial that. But I feel in the past week, things have started to change as certain events have happened both over here and in Europe that have started us on a path potentially to not a full lockdown, but in my opinion, what you can see, these far more localized lockdowns. So, yeah, first of all, we saw spikes of cases in Europe. I think there have been a few in Germany, but perhaps most notably was Spain, where the government had kind of said, yes, you're fine to go on your holidays now, and even said you could go abroad in some cases. And then about a week later, they, out of nowhere, or seemingly quite quickly, said, if you're coming back from Spain on holiday, you will be required to quarantine for up to 2 weeks, or I think that might have been reduced to 10 days.
So I think there's two things going on, because there's the separate to this, the 7-day self-isolation has been extended to 10 days based on scientific advice.
Yeah.
And I think the quarantine period is still supposed to be 14 days, because there's the idea that it can be staggered within a family group. So if it has a 7-day incubation period, the reason you want a slightly longer one is so that if one of you has got it and passed it on to the others, you have passed through that period. But I think the thing that was most interesting about that, when we say it was swift, am I right in thinking Grant Shapps, government minister, was out there and had not been told?
Yes, he was the transport minister and had just gone out there on his holidays and suddenly found himself, oh dear, I'm going to have to be quarantined. There was a picture of him a day later arriving, so maybe he got a free pass, or maybe it's about testing or whatever, or sticking in a bubble. But yes, the fact that even a government minister was caught out shows how quickly the government acted. Now, just speaking from a is this a good or bad thing by the government? I think it's probably good for the UK government that was seen to react too slowly to the first wave of coronavirus and maybe lock down too late. You want to see the government take swift and decisive actions in order to prevent a second wave. And I think that they are reacting to the data in this case, most in particular the spike of cases in Spain, to make an informed decision. However, it does still come as quite a shock to a lot of people whose holiday plans are suddenly put into disarray, or maybe work plans, or, I'm meant to be flying back to Spain today, but sorry, boss, I can't go back into work for another 2 weeks because the government has just imposed quarantine on me. It has a very real impact on people's lives. And I think the swiftness of the government response was most notable in what happened up in the north. So I know you went to the University of Manchester. Am I allowed to say that?
If anyone has looked me up on my personal website, they would know this, so don't worry. Yeah, no, I did go to Manchester, and actually I'm still in touch with quite a few people who live in Manchester, Mike from How Many Things being one of them, and it would not surprise you to learn that Manchester is not a Conservative voting constituency. You see a fair amount of criticism of the government from people who live up there anyway, but this very much has led to the memes and ire towards the government for such a sudden decision. That I think the main thing is how it seemed so silly that you couldn't go and meet up at home with other family members, but you were still being encouraged and allowed to go out to the shops. So there was I think I'd have to find the tweet, but it's like a list of all the places you can meet up, and then the one place you can't meet up is your Aunt Pat's garden.
Yeah, it seemed like, as a response, it seemed a bit like hypocritical. Is that the right word? Or just too, if you're trying to stop it, then stop it.
Yeah.
At least
enough. Yeah.
Yeah, at least lock it all down. And maybe one of the most controversial things, or one of the things that was really striking, was the fact that this happened on the eve of the Muslim festival of Eid al-Adha. This Eid, essentially, that was starting on July 31st, and the message that you couldn't mix with other households came through at 10 p.m. on July 30th. Which is essentially the equivalent of you being ready to go round your mum and dad's for Christmas dinner the next day and suddenly being told you can't, all those plans are cancelled.
Yeah, I mean, on the BBC podcasts, they had a variety of people talking, and there was someone who was on their way to their parents' house when the news dropped, and they ended up having to detour to another family member's house that was outside of the localised lockdown. So they were at least able to go somewhere else. For a lot of people, that's not the case. If they've travelled a long way, they either had to turn around or just find something different to do while they were there. And I think that's very difficult for people. And I have spoken with a few people as well who've been like, even if it wasn't the government's intention, it almost felt focused on that group of people, which is obviously not great optics, as we've discussed before on this podcast, how the government keeps making kind of missteps in this way. And then, as I say, kind of added with this weird hypocrisy of being able to do practically everything else. It didn't seem that thought through.
It's this that's kind of led to the comment now from Chris Whitty, who's the government main advisor on the pandemic, who said that we may have reached the limit of lockdown easing. Sort of, okay, we've said things are getting back to normal, but they're not going to be normal for a long while. And we still all need to keep up the social distancing measures, or else we're going to have to get stricter, like what's happening up in Manchester and up in the north at the moment. It's this big balancing act the government now has between stopping a second wave and trying to keep the economy going, which is nearly impossible to do, I would say. We've all got used to the phrase the new normal. I know everybody's getting tired of that now, but just going out and doing things nowadays takes a lot more time. It's more of a planned operation. It's slower, and that means that's probably not as profitable for businesses that can pack lots of people in and make the most of rush hours and peak times. If you have rush hours and peak times, you need more staff, you can employ more people, also means you can make more money, etc., etc., etc. Planning it out might be a better experience for the consumer. I know that my wife has gone to the gym today and enjoyed the fact that there are only so many people allowed in at one time. You get slightly more personalized feeling about it, but for the business involved, it's not so good, and they have to, every business has to readjust.
And especially if you look at things, most kind of forms of entertainment, whether it be pubs, clubs, even restaurants and bars, a lot of them are based on the concept that they're going to get 80% occupancy during rush periods, Saturdays, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, basically. And then they're not open, they might not be open during the day, during the week or something. All of their business plans are based on the concept that they're going to get 80% occupancy at rush times, if not better. And suddenly they're having to, socially distance everyone and everything. And that can affect, I will not be surprised if a lot of clubs, pubs and things will go out of business despite, the various injections of cash that have come along. Because, anecdotally, there's still not as many people going to the pub as far as I can see. I think people are feeling a bit freer the last week or so, as you say. But I definitely feel like, personally, I know that I have not really been going down the pub like super frequently. I'm sure there are people who are always down there. I've seen people in the pub. I've been to a few pubs since everything reopened, but it still feels a bit weird, and I definitely don't think they're anywhere near their kind of normal occupancy. It's
kind of a fact that this isn't over, or the fact that a second wave could potentially shut more things down. In the north, if their reaction was to not let households mingle, if that doesn't stop the spread of the virus, then I think the next logical step would be to stop people going to, pubs and shops, or as many as they can. I know people have brought in, the face mask measures to try and make everything as safe as you possibly can. But it might be that the only solution in some areas is to go back on a full lockdown. Now, it's my opinion that we probably won't see a national lockdown like we did before. I feel that was almost a reaction to the virus is in the country. We don't know exactly where it's spread or got to, because everybody was still mingling a lot between when the virus came in and when we decided to get it under control. We've talked about examples like the Cheltenham Festival before. That's lots of people from around the country congregating in one area where a virus can spread, and then it's spread out. So now people are moving less. You can try and lock it down to those specific areas, and I think it would be far too economically damaging to the country to go ahead and lock the whole thing down again. But I think local lockdowns are something that we are going to see more of in the future. And the next big thing is to see how the economy copes through this crisis, in particular what happens in October. I know furlough schemes are meant to last and have been extended until October, but this is me anecdotally speaking. I've known a handful of people who unfortunately have lost their jobs because of COVID, and they may be in jobs that are particularly affected by the crisis, so they might work in the entertainment industry or the aviation industry. I've had people who've worked in the retail industry who are on 0 hours contracts who have said, they were the first to go from the staff that were furloughed because, unfortunately, 0 hour contracts will be, because they are the easiest people to let go, unfortunately. So it's bringing up, this crisis isn't just about a virus, it's bringing up a lot of things, inequalities in the system. I know 0 hours contracts was something that Labour in particular were stressing about how fair they actually were and how they didn't provide a stable amount of employment. It's becoming particularly true in these times. So, I think I just wanted to highlight this story of the PM, slamming the brake on lockdown, on the easing, is the first sign of the government having to walk that very odd tightrope of how do we keep the economy going but still save lives and stop this virus from spreading, and for the NHS to become overwhelmed. There's no point shutting the economy down once only to not bother the second time around and have the NHS overwhelmed in a second wave, because you'll have undone all your hard work that you attempted to do the first time. So tricky situation, and seeing how the government reacts to a potential second wave, given how, I think it's fair to say, looking back, it's considered that the UK did fairly poorly in their response when you compare it to, excess death rates and what's happened in other countries, probably excluding the United States of America there, in how they're coping. I feel the government feels it has an obligation to act quicker this time, but will the public have the goodwill to go ahead with a stricter lockdown after some of the actions the government has taken in the first one?
And I think, I know we've touched on it before, but there's been various discussion about how the kind of general feeling towards lockdown from the public was affected by the whole Cummings scandal and all of that. So it will be, I think, it's not only do they have this interesting tightrope to walk but the average person might be less inclined to follow the rules unless you start slapping large fines on it and so on. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. And I don't think we can really... I mean, we can only speculate at this point, and things are changing so quickly again that, we will just have to wait and see with a lot of this, I'm afraid. So shall we move on to our main story for the evening?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's go ahead.
So our main story, I don't know if you saw this amongst all that coronavirus news that's been around, but there was a report released on Russian interference into the UK election cycle. Did anyone pay attention to this as it went past? I mean, I know that people paying attention to the political pages will have seen it, but I feel it kind of got subsumed by everything else a bit.
Yeah, and that's precisely the reason I wanted to bring it up again. I had to kind of... When this was happening, when they said that the Russia report was going to be released, I was kind of like glued to my laptop and had, oh my goodness, they're releasing this live. This seemed like a really big political report that I wanted to be involved in. And the fact that it hasn't really kept any traction in the news is why I want to talk about it today. So, Russia report. Had you heard of the Russia report before this point? Had you heard it sort of like whispered about in anti-Johnson circles?
No, I had heard about it. I think it came up at the very least on the BBC's newscast, coronavirus cast, whatever you want to call it. It used to be Brexit cast. They definitely mentioned it ahead of time. But yeah, I definitely heard it kind of coming up that it was supposed to come out. It had been delayed, and everyone was kind of like, oh, that's a bit iffy. And I know enough people who kind of keep an eye on politics that news had filtered through to me. But I don't know how big a story it was, like on main news channels before they actually released the report. Once the report came out, I definitely saw more discussion on it. It
was kind of like a Politico report. Like, if you're really into your politics, you might like this. And the fact that it had been... The Russia report had been produced by the Intelligence and Security Committee, which is one of the most important select committees that work within the government. They are an organisation of 9 MPs, 5 of them from the ruling party, and then the other 4 are made up of, essentially, you take a slice of how many opposition MPs there are in Parliament and try and give them a fair divide. So I think it has like 2 Labour MPs and 2 SNP MPs, because they're the ones that are the main opposition parties that are in there. But anyway, they are seen to be one of the more important committees because they deal with affairs of state, of, foreign interference, etc. And particularly when you've got something going across the pond like the Trump impeachment and Mueller's investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election, people were thought of expecting that this report would look at much the same kind of ideas. That Mueller report coincidentally kind of said that, yes, there was undoubtedly Russian interference in the 2016 election, probably not with the voting itself, but within the campaigning that went around it. The WikiLeaks story that leaks during the election, and in particular the hacking of the Democratic National Committee emails, was almost certainly perpetrated by Russia. The kind of Facebook farms and the targeted ads were also kind of coming from Russia, and most notably, Russia seemed very much in favour of Trump winning that election rather than Hillary Clinton. With these things, it's always impossible to know exactly what bearing that had on the result. So you can never say, oh, this Russian, definitely this Russian Facebook ad convinced this person and that was enough to, tip that state in that favour. But it was clear that Russia was trying to have an influence on a democratic process outside of its own country's borders. And with this report, it was sort of suspected that the same thing had happened potentially in UK elections, or most notably the 2016 Brexit referendum, because it's probably no surprise to think that Russia would be on the side of Brexit winning because it destabilises the EU, which they see as a major competitor for, political power and resources in the region. Russia, of course, not a member of the EU. So that was kind of what was expected out of this report, and it got dodgier and dodgier as the Johnson government refused to publish it for a variety of different reasons. So it was supposed to be published before the election, right? Originally. Before the 2019 election, yeah. So I can understand why it would be delayed if you're the incumbent government, and it did not show you in the best of lights. And that's what people were thinking. And then even after Johnson won, he said on the day after he won, yes, this will be published. Then it wasn't until February when he said, oh yeah, we will publish this, but we have to wait until the committee has elected a new chair, because we need a new chair, because the former one, Dominic Grieve, who had been, I think he lost his seat during the 2019 election and had been one of the more prominent Conservative Remainers, you might remember.
Yeah, he made a lot of amendments that we discussed at length at the time.
Yes. Yeah. He's not a fan of the Johnson government not a fan of him, so definitely fallen out of favour, and I think lost his seat in that election, or at least been deselected. So, yes, they were looking for a new chair, and the Boris Johnson administration was looking to put their own man in charge. Who's a man for a crisis? If you were looking for a competent minister, okay, one who has a proven track record of success and getting things done, who would you pick?
I mean, not Chris Grayling.
Yes.
He would be the last person I'd pick.
In an odd move of political strategy, the Johnson government decided to pick Christopher Grayling, or Failing Grayling, to take him by his other name, to try and become the head of this committee. He was already a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee, and all he had to do was secure the votes of himself and the 4 other Conservative MPs who were part of that committee. At the 11th hour, another minister, Julian Lewis, who basically said that I've been a member of this committee for far longer and I have some background in security and intelligence, which Christopher Grayling doesn't. A small aside, I was listening to another podcast today and they made the point that if you can't find in about 300-odd MPs one Conservative MP who has some background in security or intelligence, then you're really doing a bad job, because half of them are retired generals or have done other things like that. There's a lot of expertise. It's the equivalent. They made the assumption that it's the equivalent of Labour struggling to find somebody who worked in education, because half of Labour MPs were former teachers or worked in education in some stage. But no, they picked Christopher Grayling. Julian Lewis essentially went behind his back and talked to all the other opposition MPs and said, look, if you vote for me, I'll vote for myself and we can win this vote 5-4. Julian Lewis won, embarrassing the government in the process, and the government retaliated by removing the whip from Julian Lewis and saying that you are no longer a member of the Conservative Party. I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent here, but I want your opinion on it first. Okay. How do you think, as a government with a majority of 80 that Boris Johnson has, do you think that's an easy majority to handle? Or, do you have to worry about parliamentary discipline when you've got a majority of 80? Or do you think that you can just let it slide to an extent?
I mean, my understanding of it is, compared to the kind of very close majorities we've had for some time, is that there is definitely a lot more leeway for Boris. And I think his actions are lined up with that, in that he's happy to lose an MP here or there, but there's only so many MPs you can, if you lose an MP a week after 80 weeks, you've suddenly lost your majority, and that's not all the way through your term.
After 40 weeks, because remember, 80 is the majority.
Yes. And yes, a majority is the difference between two numbers. So yes.
Yeah.
That would assume that they fully defected to the other side, though, and weren't kind of weird floating voters in the middle. But yes, I see the point. If you're losing an MP every week, it's not going to end well for you. I'm not sure how many he has lost. I don't have that number to hand. But I think that's basically kind of Boris is feeling like he can be bullish, and we talked about this before. It's a bit of cronyism, and his mates are in there, and that was, we didn't think that was going to necessarily be fine for Brexit, but suddenly this has been thrown into sharp relief by stuff going on with coronavirus, that's kind of problematic, because these people don't necessarily have the skills they need to lead various departments, because they're Boris's mates and not the best person for the job. But I think he can probably get away with it for a bit longer, and he clearly thinks he can if he keeps removing the whip from people.
So I think Boris says he can get away with this. However, in my opinion, I think their strategy is very short-sighted, in that it ignores the fact that you still have to have some degree of parliamentary unity within your party, and even out of a selection of 300-odd MPs, all of those need to think that somewhere along the line, even though there's only about 60 jobs around cabinet and not shadow cabinet, but junior ministerial positions, all of them need to think that in some way they can weasel your way into your favours and they can stop being a backbench MP at some point. What the Johnson/Cummings way of doing things is showing me is that they think that they're fine with a core group of 120 MPs who, will follow them to the ends of the earth. And then the rest of the Conservative MPs, Sodom, they're Conservative MPs, they should just vote for us. and if they don't, we'll throw them out. But it's meaning that more and more Conservative MPs are rebelling, and I think you can see that reflected in the number of U-turns the Johnson administration has been forced to make, basically because Conservative MPs have already said, if you bring this to me, I'll probably rebel on the issue and it will be embarrassing for you. You should U-turn on this before we even vote on it. And in some cases, there've been the Mog Conga that we talked about and the weird voting legislation the weird voting rules in the House of Commons that were overturned by Johnson when it was seen how ridiculous it was, what a farce it was in the Commons. They sometimes just let those bonkers ideas destroy themselves. And I think this just Johnson failing to get his man onto this committee, and then the subsequent response of throwing him out the party. I think they throw him out the party, so when they say the chair of the Independent Security Committee is a independent rather than a Conservative, it might distance the committee from the government's point of view a little. But then again, these committees have always meant to be seen as fairly independent anyway. I would want an independent chair of a Intelligence and Security Committee anyway. I want them doing the best for the country, not necessarily what's best for the Conservative Party. So, yeah, that's just my little aside.
Just to kind of round out this aside, I would like to ask you, so we've discussed in the past over several issues of the podcast about how the one thing the Conservative Party has been consistently good at, as one of the oldest political institutions in the world, is eventually pulling, in a time of crisis, eventually pulling itself together and remaining the Conservative Party, whether it means expelling its leaders or whatever. The Conservative Party is very good at maintaining itself and not splitting up in the way Labour did like 30, 40 years ago and stuff like that. Do you think this is a particularly tense time within the Conservatives based on what we're seeing? Are we expecting either them to oust Boris or them to split at this point? Because I know that was the thing that was discussed pre the general election and with all the stuff going on with Brexit, but it seems like Boris has kind of come through that with this bigger majority. Or is it a shift in what the Conservative Party is?
Ooh, good question.
I'm getting there. I've been listening to you enough that I've learned how to make questions.
I think the Conservative Party is still ruthless enough to stab Boris in the back if they feel that he is an electoral liability rather than an asset. So I think before the general election and the majority that he was able to deliver in December 2019, he was certainly seen as an asset for the party. Not somebody that everybody necessarily agreed with, but somebody who seemed to capture the public spirit or awareness or was able to get a large enough amount of the public on side with the Conservatives to vote for them when they hadn't before, in particular in those more northern, traditionally Labour-leaning constituencies. I think it is fair to say that Boris's tactics brought those people on board and delivered a majority. However, his actions, particularly during, the handling of the coronavirus outbreak and the way you saw his popularity kind of dwindle because of the response. I think we mentioned on previous podcasts how his personal polling was suffering in light of of Cummings and how he reacted to that, how he was unwilling to get rid of a special advisor, seemingly against the advice of, official medical advice and what the rest of the country had been following. I think it's still fair to say there's a large amount of the country that's still angry about that, even if the Conservative Party insists that they have moved on. There will still be those people who bear a grudge. And within the Conservative Party, particularly when he had those very poor PMQs against Keir Starmer, there are rumblings that, oh no, we might have been sold a dud here. He may have been good in an election, but actually fairly poor at running the country. And eyes are already turning towards Rishi Sunak as the next PM in waiting.
Yeah, I mean, he's done the traditional thing, right? Be a chancellor who has achieved a certain amount of goodwill with the public by doing something sensible financially. That's generally a good position to be in if you want to become Prime Minister, right?
Oh, yeah. And he's had the briefings that he's had to deliver have kind of always been the really good news ones. Like, I'm giving you a load of free money for, to furlough and I'll protect your jobs. While Boris Johnson has had to deliver the tougher messages, or even when Boris has tried to deliver the more positive messages, they're always sort of tinged with a, oh, I'm actually only giving 20 pence to the NHS to make sure they don't have to pay for their car parking anymore. Rishi will come out and saying, I'm giving £1 billion because I'm so great.
Yeah.
So there's certainly a difference in popularity, how they're perceived by the general public. So I feel, going back to your original question, I think the Conservative Party is still ruthless enough to get rid of Boris if they see him as an electoral liability. They did it with Theresa May very effectively, and you might see more of a backlash because Boris has an attack dog in Dominic Cummings, who proved pre the 2019 election that he wasn't afraid to throw out Conservatives who didn't agree with Boris. That's why suddenly the Conservatives technically lost their majority before the election because of the voting on Brexit and them removing the whip from all the Conservative MPs who voted on a more Remain side of things. But to those MPs who do it, who get the whip removed, they'll shrug their shoulders and go, well, whatever I do, I'm not going to be invited to get a job in Boris Johnson's cabinet, so why should I bother? Why shouldn't I rebel again? You're not giving me a reason to do that. And if they continue to rebel throughout the next 5 years, they could potentially make it quite difficult for them. So, I hope that goes some way to answering your question.
So before we move into kind of the real meat, the rest of the story about Russian interference, I just want to be very clear that when we're talking about this Russian meddling, we're talking about a very specific side of the Russian state. And it's quite important to separate that from the Russian people, because I think that often is a line that is blurred in the media, and more so in America, where they still have this kind of anti-communist vibe, which I don't think we ever really had over here in the same way. But I just want to be clear about that up front. And for people who want a deeper dive into anything to do with Russian politics, I would totally recommend the podcast The Naked Pravda. Meduza is a Russian news organization, and it tries to do proper investigative reporting. And The Naked Pravda is their first English language podcast. It was recommended to me by a Russian person as a thing to listen to get a better insight into the country. And I found that very interesting. And I don't think they've tackled this topic just yet, but I'm sure it's the kind of thing they will come to, because they have a bit more of a trying to aim towards American audience vibe. But it's very interesting and gives you a bigger picture of what's going on. And like when we say Russian in this case, we're talking about specific parts of the Russian state and people under Putin. That's not the same thing as all Russians by any stretch of the imagination. And please bear that in mind, because I wouldn't want people to think that's what we're suggesting. It's very much a kind of, there are people in Russia who don't like Putin and how he seems to be grabbing power and so on. So that's a whole big issue that we're not going to go into right now, but I want to just make that clear up front. So talking about that, what did the government do to deal with these reports of meddling?
So, as I've set up, we know that there had been Russian interference in the US election, and that there was the potential for it to happen in our elections, most particularly the Brexit referendum of 2016. The Intelligence and Security Committee found out that the government had avoided looking into Russian meddling altogether, and this was from governments from Cameron to Johnson. So that's Cameron, May, and Johnson had all tried to turn a blind eye to it. It was revealed that nobody within the government had even asked the question of, if the Russians have meddled in the US, maybe we should have a look at this Brexit thing, see if they did any for that. They simply refused to look at it, or refused to put a department or a singular person as responsible for that task. The Intelligence and Security Committee also looked at the role of MI6, because you may argue that it is the job of those security forces to essentially say, hey, government, we've found some evidence, you should act on this. But in this instance, they weren't willing to take on that responsibility because nobody said that they should. The phrase the committee used was that it was a political hot potato being passed around from civil servant to other departments, nobody wanting to say, let's investigate Brexit, because maybe understandably from a civil service point of view, they are meant to be independent, so they shouldn't be making that political judgment. It is for the government to decide, particularly on an issue as controversial as Brexit. However, the fact that you don't look when there's been clear evidence that it's been happening in other countries, and this is probably a thing that you want to avoid in the future. You don't want to have other states meddling in your state's affairs, particularly in a democracy where we've spoken about it countless times on this podcast before, how democracies and elections are changing with the availability of information that you can get off the internet and the reliability of those sources, and how places like Facebook and Google can target adverts to your demographic and how powerful those tools are for turning somebody who... We've all seen the Cambridge Analytica stuff, which kind of suggested that you could take a Disney princesses quiz that would tell out your personality as a Disney princess, and from that information they can kind of determine, oh, this person might be culturally or, psychologically inclined to vote for a more freedom-loving Brexit argument if we give it to them. Let's try and put that idea in their Facebook feed. Nobody in the government had even looked at the possibility of Russia doing that, which was shocking. But perhaps the most striking thing was that when MI6 were asked about Brexit meddling, they replied with only 6 lines of text, which were pretty sort of like bland and, the committee asked us for a statement. We gave one because we were required to. A bit like when you send an email to somebody at work who's more important than you and you know that they really don't have time for your email or don't want to get drawn into your petty squabbles. They give a kind of a very bland, neutral answer. That's what MI6 got or gave to the committee.
And I mean, obviously, we don't expect necessarily to get all of the inner workings of MI6, but you would assume that MI6 would be following up on anything that's perceived a threat. So that suggests that the problem there is like a lack of leadership. People not you'd expect MI6 to look into it, even if the government didn't tell them to a little bit, just to be on the safe side. But the government kind of needs to tell MI6 what to be doing in that point of view. So if their reply is very empty, it suggests that MI6 was not told to do anything.
Precisely. And just the government did have a response to this. In particular, the committee suggested that the Brexit referendum, be investigated. That was one of their big suggestions that came out of the report. The government rejected that appeal on the same day, saying, "We have seen no evidence of successful interference in the EU referendum, and no new information has emerged." Which basically, I think, doesn't defend them, because of course you found nothing. You haven't been looking. It's not enough to say, well, no new evidence has emerged. No new evidence has emerged of me looking up. I can't think of a good example because I didn't prepare anything. But you know what I mean. I can. No evidence has found. I have found no evidence of corruption in the Scandinavian curling team federation, because guess what? I haven't been investigating the Scandinavian curling team. It's a completely empty and meaningless statement that sounds like it's important, but isn't. And that's the big frustration from this Russia report, I think, that people were expecting a bombshell about Brexit, and for this report to finally say, oh, this is the proof of Russian interference in the Brexit referendum that we knew about all along. And the report basically says, we can't tell you if there was or not because the government has refused to look. And that's worrying at a level and disappointing, and then to have it dismissed out of hand by... It's no surprise the government has done it, because what political capital... what good does it do Boris Johnson to investigate Brexit now and suggest that there was heavy Russian interference? It does undermine a lot of what Boris Johnson is aiming for in the goals of his administration.
It's interesting because you'd think normally... you'd think... I mean, it's not quite the same as in America, where there's always been this kind of anti-communist rhetoric that still goes on today. You don't really see people shouting at Jeremy Corbyn for being a communist as a bad thing in this country in the same way. Like, if you see news articles on him coming from the US, it's a very different state of affairs. It's interesting because you would expect the idea of someone meddling in British politics who is not British to be something that would be anathema to the Conservative Party in what they present to the public. So it's interesting, and we can understand why, if it undermines their own election chances, why they might want to brush it under the rug. But it seems like the kind of thing where you'd normally expect someone to come out and say, oh no, we're going to very strongly investigate this, we're going to do blah, 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 we're going to make all this safety, and well, here's a whole load of new laws about it, because that's the kind of thing the Conservative Party normally does. But what are the reasons, other than the electoral side of things, where it would undermine the current government, what are other reasons that may have prevented this being investigated? Is there corruption involved? Is there money changing hands? Is there something else that might be causing this as well as that?
So another thing that report picked up on was kind of the way that Russian wealth has been embedded in society, particularly in London, and in some key figures in particularly in the Lords. And although those Lords weren't named, they are expected to be. Russian money apparently has influenced both Conservative and Labour peers, maybe on the way that they voted. And there was quite a striking headline in the Metro the day after this report, basically saying Londongrad, where it appeared that that London was a well-known safe haven. It appeared for Russian money, and it had been for the past decade. It was, that's another worrying thing to hear, particularly that Russian money may be getting involved in politics, in the Lords, in certain charities and other organisations, and that is another example of the Russian state under Putin using kind of soft power to undermine democracy. There are many pressure points that you can put on democracy through like different charities, and pressure groups may have access to ministers to try and influence them towards your decision, or ask a question during PMQs, or if you fund somebody, they might be less inclined to ask a question about the Russian state, etc., etc. Like, I'm plucking these ideas off the top of my head because they're the kind of things that could be done, and none of these were suggested as being definitively done in the report. But to have known state actors from Russia acting in those ways to important figures in British life and British politics is again another example of how Russian influence may be undermining British democracy, and the fact, again, that very little had been done to stop or monitor this threat was a worry to the Intelligence and Security Committee, and kind of suggests that the government had been slow to act about what is a clear and growing threat from Russia when it comes to how they try and influence other people's democracies. And like I say, it shouldn't come as a surprise. It's happened we've got proof of it happening in the US. It's not unthinkable to think that the UK would be the next target on that list.
So, kind of tying back to what we were talking about earlier, we said like the government has not been paying as much attention because it might undermine them, etc. But now that they've been challenged in public, how have they responded to all these criticisms we're raising, which have been raised by people more informed than us already?
So, as I mentioned, they released their report, their reaction to the report at the same time the report was being released, which is an odd move. Even the Julian Lewis, the chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, basically signed off to the media saying, I think it's disgraceful that sending their reaction at the same time we're telling you all this information, we're not getting, this is a show of that we're not really getting much cooperation with the government over these matters that we think are incredibly important. And they've already pushed that Brexit referendum stuff to the side. They've kind of said, we'll look into it more now. We recognise that Russia is a threat, but you've also got to remember there are other threats like China, and we acted decisively over Huawei. That's up for debate as well. They maybe acted too late on Huawei with how integrated they are to the UK's mobile phone network, and that may have come from pressure from the US and Trump. I think Trump even tried to claim credit for the UK rejecting parts of the Huawei deal for the mobile services.
In fact, I would say the main thing with that is actually that the US changed certain laws, which makes the subtle thing there was we were fine with Huawei stuff up until the US changed their rules on certain components, and then that actually changes. It's a far more involved topic. But it's not as simple to say that the US pressured us to do it. It's more that the US changed the technicality of certain things that made it a lot easier for us to then say, well, based on this evidence, we're going to do this. But that is an aside.
It's like it shows a bit of whataboutery from the government, I feel. Like, you may say that Russia's bad, but remember, China's bad too. And China is doing some pretty bad things at the moment. Not to mention, I'm going to pronounce it wrong. What's the name of the Muslim concentration camps they've got there? What is it? The Uyghur people?
Uyghur, yes. Obviously, terrible what's happening over there.
Yeah, the human rights abuses over there are equally terrible. But newsflash: it's possible for two things to be terrible at once. If this crisis is teaching us anything, it's that many things can be terrible at once. But yeah, that's one of the government's tactics to try and deflect away from what was said there. I watched PMQs, which was coincidentally the last PMQs of before the summer recess, and I expected Keir Starmer to go quite hard on Russia. He did, but the way that the government pushed back against that was bringing up Jeremy Corbyn's response to the Salisbury poisonings, which was probably the most memorable act of Russian interference in the UK because it involved a literal murder and was much more headline grabbing, with the two Russian agents, just popping over there to see the lovely cathedral. Jeremy Corbyn's response at the time was seen as too pro-Russia, or at least, he was saying that we shouldn't act so quickly, we should wait until we've got all the evidence acquired, and was seen by many at the time as maybe a little too soft. In his defence, I think he was just trying to, get evidence before we acted too quickly and may have escalated the situation, but it was widely reported in the press that this was a fairly weak response, and Boris Johnson tried to tie Keir Starmer to this whole issue and make the issue of, the Conservatives, we're strong on Russia. When we were in power and the swords poisonings happened, we, worked with European countries to expel every Russian diplomat, while Jeremy Corbyn said these things and Keir Starmer sat on his hands and said nothing, which again is number one, that was proven to be a lie. Keir Starmer was shown on Question Time days after the attack, condemning it roundly and saying that it's a very, very bad thing. And secondly, that is again another piece of deflection, just trying to say, oh, at least we're not Labour dealing with Russia, which is kind of I think it's ultimately a really bad way to deflect, because the report clearly shows that you've had 3 Conservative Prime Ministers for the past 6 years, from 2014 to 2020, who have failed to act on anything. And the Salisbury poisoning may be one of the issues where they reacted quite strongly, but they couldn't prevent it, and it was a much more reactive measure rather than active surveillance, etc., etc. And they're trying to say that, look, if you investigated the Salisbury poisonings, you probably should go and investigate these other elections as well. The Salisbury poisoning is one where it's far more electorally viable for the Conservatives to investigate that. There's no bad. You can't say that benefited the Conservative Party in any way. The result of the Brexit referendum or the 2019 election or whatever may seem differently. They also brought up, oddly, just before the report announced, sorry if I'm skipping back here, but I think it's worth bringing up, the government said that it hadn't looked into any sort of Russian interference, but a couple of days before this report was released, I think it was Priti Patel, but I may be wrong, so maybe cut this bit out, but somebody within the government said that, we've got proof of Russian leaking interfering in an election. In 2019, Russian agents leaked to Reddit evidence that the Conservative Party was considering selling off parts of the NHS if they did a trade deal with the US, if we couldn't do a trade deal with the EU. And that was something that Jeremy Corbyn's team used and promoted and tried to get them to, win a majority in that election. The fact that the Conservatives picked up on that, I think, again, just undermines their position of they're only interested in investigating the Russian interference when it makes the other side look bad. The fact that they are trying to say that Russia was in favour of Labour winning that election, they're trying to show us proof as, Russia only really tries to help people when it isn't the Conservative Party, when actually they should be. The Intelligence and Security Committee says that you should investigate Russian interference, regardless of which party it benefits, regardless of who it benefits. If it's another state interfering with our actions as the UK, that's something we should be concerned about. I think the fact that this report has faded away in the public memory, that it's failed to gain any traction, it's a very crowded news cycle at the moment, of course, and I think COVID will always dominate the headlines, but this report really has failed to make any real traction, put any real heat under the government, but I think that may be the next time Russia interferes in an election, and it's proven that, again, no action has been taken to prevent it. I think that's when the next big scandal will happen, because at least the Intelligence and Security Committee will be able to say, we told you so, and we pointed out that you ignored it for 4 years, and this has happened again, and you've still ignored it. I think it gets even less forgivable if they keep ignoring it and keep trying to brush it away, because I don't think that Russian interference in elections while Putin is in charge is going to go anywhere soon. I think they've proved that they can get results from their actions, and that if they can, you can maybe say in the case of, Donald Trump, if they can get the man they want into power, then that man is just happy being in power and decides not to do anything. You can see Russia's relation with Trump has been, Trump's kind of come out and had some disastrous press conferences with Putin saying, he's not all that a bad guy, blah, blah, blah. Russia will be very happy with that result, and they're probably very happy with result they've had in the UK so far.
I mean, the worrying thing, if any outside actor influences one person's vote in the election, I would consider that a bad thing. I think I would be safe in saying, it's fine for... So, okay, this is tricky because the obvious anti-argument to what I'm saying is that if you lived in a country that was on the face of it democratic, or at least you had a vote, but it was in some way oppressive, and you learnt from the country next door that there was a better way of doing things, that might change your vote. But that is very different to the kind of thing we're talking about. So I appreciate there is the phrase I said just then was maybe out of context, too defined a thing, but that basic idea that being that like any amount of interference by an outside state is not okay, essentially. And it doesn't matter if it's one or two voters who get swayed or loads. But I think, as you say, it seems like it's here to stay under the Putin regime. He's doing similar things in his own country. Go listen to the Naked Pravda, where they talk about his recent changing the rules so that he can stay president for longer and things like that. He's around to stay, it would seem, at the moment. And if he wants to meddle in elections, it seems like that's here to stay if we don't put significant resources into investigating it and then putting in our own safeguards. And it seems that there is this move, it's hard, as we said, you need to separate the people who live in a country from the actions of their government. But there are issues with both Russia and China at the moment where it seems like at the state level, they wish to have some kind of role. And that there's various things. There's been books published on how this is the new era of warfare. It's all cyber warfare and stuff like that. And maybe it doesn't go as far as some people are suggesting, but I definitely think it's a thing we should at least be paying attention to. And I think that's all we're asking from this report is like, it should at least be investigated a bit. And I don't think that's an unreasonable thing as a citizen of this country to ask.
Yeah, precisely.
So as usual, in a second, you'll have a quick advert for another show on our podcast network. Good evening and welcome to the bar. Join Dr. Wilko as he investigates the histories of your favourite spirits and your favourite cocktails while mixing you a drink at the bar. The other bars may be closed, but a podcast bar will always remain open. So I think we'll move on now to our quick polls update. And as usual, we're looking at the ongoing US presidential race. As we say, it's hotting up. It's not that far away, despite Trump saying things like, I'm going to delay the election, which you may want to comment on in a second. But so at the moment, the national poll is saying that Biden has an 8-point lead, Biden 50.2% versus Trump's 41.9%. So that's widened since March, as we've been discussing. It's got a bit closer a few times, but it just seems like it's consistently widening. It's not as wide as it has been. There was a peak where it was at like plus 10, but it's still pretty wide. So these are rolling averages. Very few of the polls cross over in the middle again. So there's, the last few weeks, there's no red Trump poll that's put Trump higher than any of the blue Biden polls. So there's still that kind of gap there. 8.3 point lead for Biden at the moment. And if we look at Trump's approval-disapproval rating, since the start of July, he has recovered a bit, but he's still on 55% of people disapproving and 41% of people approving of him. So it's still, quite a lot of disapproval for Trump. What kind of faux pas and stuff has he made in the last few weeks that has led into this, hasn't managed to fix his apparent lack of lead?
Yeah, so I think, as we touched on in the earlier part of the podcast, America's response to COVID-19 and particularly their kind of second wave that's enveloping Trump states, in particular Florida and Texas. These states that had previously been held up as shining examples of how you do lockdown, how you open up the economy safely and how, actually it's all fine. Suddenly they're finding out that it isn't, and they're suffering in the same way that New York did at the start of the pandemic in the US. And Trump's inability to seem to get that under control with some leadership has brought him under a lot of fire. I can't remember if we mentioned it last time, but Trump has only recently been seen wearing a mask and being a convert to wearing them, which shows that he is changing his messaging somewhat. The fact that you've had the return to the daily press briefings also suggests that things have got worse rather than better when it comes to coronavirus cases in the US. He was recently praised for quite a normal doing inverted commas around the microphone again, normal press conference where he kind of read from the script and stayed on message. But that's always been juxtaposed with what he says on Twitter. I believe that it was either him or his son got banned from Twitter. That was right. His son got briefly banned from Twitter by sharing an anti-mask doctor who suggested that COVID-19 was the result of people having sex with demons.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's quite out there as theories go. That's almost up there with aliens. Insert famous gif here.
Not that the video showed saying that, like, if you have sex with demons, you will get COVID-19, but the doctors the people used as proof that masks don't work were maybe discredited doctors who had quite odd ideas about everything. So I don't think that has helped the Trump administration to stay on message when it comes to COVID-19. Also, as you mentioned earlier, Trump did suggest that the election be postponed until this whole COVID-19 thing blows over.
I think my favourite headline that I saw was someone shared me the New York Times headline, which is Trump suggests, and quoted him, election may have to be delayed. I can't remember the exact word he used, comma, which he cannot do. Very rarely do I like a headline. Often headlines are a bit clickbaity, they draw you in, and then it's like, nope, that was the most informative headline you could have given me. Top marks. I was
also really impressed by the way the BBC covered this as well, because their headline was something along the lines of Truss suggests delaying the election because of the reason he gave was like potential voting fraud, and then the colon was these claims have been unsubstantiated and there's hardly any evidence of voting fraud when it comes to mail-in votes. And it's because, this isn't new for Trump. We've always known that even though he won the 2016 election through the Electoral College, he lost the popular vote. And it was an early Trump theory that there were a lot of fake voters in the Democratic areas. And actually, if all these fake voters hadn't, put in these erroneous ballots, then you would have seen Trump would have won the popular vote as well. So it's not a new Trump conspiracy theory. But every time he's tried to have it investigated, no evidence has come back. But it's still one that he maintains and is happy to share. And it was this one that he was trying to say, look, we can't rely on the evidence to be truthful if you're going to do only mail-in ballots in a lot of states. We're going to have to postpone it. Like you say, he can't do it. And a lot of senior Republicans were quick to say, I'm sorry, you can't do this. And it may just be a reflection of how poorly he feels he's doing in the polls. There's always a long way to go, and I think if you look back at 2016, there are some polls that put Hillary about 10 percentage points up against Trump at some point during the election cycle, and yet again, this is a very weird election cycle. We've yet to see it sort of tighten, see those debates, and I know there are plenty of questions about Biden hasn't even picked a running mate yet, and that might throw a few new things, a few spanners into the works, or might prove to be a vote winner or a vote loser. We haven't even seen the Republican or Democratic national conventions yet. The Republicans have already stated that this will be the first one that happens behind closed doors with no media invited. Their reason is we can't do it because of coronavirus, but also I think it might just be an odd national convention to be at. We all know that Trump's going to get nominated, but how he starts fighting his campaign will be particularly weird. If I was Trump now, I don't know what I start campaigning on or how I frame it. Traditionally, he was all about the economy is doing well. He can't do that anymore. I don't think he can do it off the strength of his reaction to COVID-19, because as we say, that's one of, potentially the worst responses that there have been in the entire world. So he's got to fall back on some of his more traditional, like culture wars type of things. He's trying to push the law and order agenda when it comes to protests in Portland, and there have been a number of controversial tactics used there, most notably unmarked federal agents dragging protesters into unmarked vans. Oh, that's a big thing that's happening in Portland and seems to be violating a whole load of civil liberties, unsurprisingly. So Trump is trying to turn this election into a cities versus countryside election because he feels he can win countryside, but it would appear latest polling figures put him well behind. Biden again just needs to not do anything stupid between now and the election, but there's a lot of time for a lot of stupid.
So as always, Rob, thank you for joining me Thank you for giving me your insights into things and sharing them with the listeners. You can find us in all the usual places. If you go to parliamentary.observer, you will find the podcast. You'll be able to comment on posts. You'll find links to all the places you can get the RSS feed if you need to share it with people. And you can find links in there to various other places where we are in the show notes as well. So Facebook, Reddit, etc. We always like to hear back from you, and that's always great. I don't know if you're aware of Esther Day, Rob.
I'm not. Please tell me more.
It's a nerd fighter holiday, which is our fans of the Green Brothers. I consider myself a nerd fighter involved in a bit of the community. And there was a nerd fighter back in the early days of Nerdfighteria who had cancer and sadly passed away, but she was all about sharing love with, like that kind of a platonic love you have between friends. And family as well. It's one of those things you don't share often enough. And because obviously the Vlog Brothers are two brothers, this ended up with some videos where they were saying they loved each other online, and then this has now turned into a holiday that happens on the 3rd of August every year, an internet holiday where people reach out and say how they appreciate people that they work with or whatever, like just not your romantic partner, basically. So firstly, this is a chance to say I appreciate you, Rob, and I thank you for joining me on this podcast and being here. Love you, Rob. And the other thing is I wanted to share a bit of feedback, which I'll do so anonymously, but I know the person listens to the podcast, so they'll know it's them. I listen to Unparliamentary Language every time an episode releases. Your podcast led to my enjoyment in understanding British history and politics and the overwhelming amount of books I have. So it's feedback like that as well. Like, yeah, you can share it with people if you want to get more people listening to it. That's great. But we're doing this as a hobby because we want to do it. And hearing people who really like the podcast is obviously one of the best things we can hear. So that keeps us wanting to do it as well.
That's awesome. Yeah. That's wow. Blown away by that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I know you can hear Rob hitting the mic stand that was bought with the proceeds from Patreon. So go to patreon.com.
That was me flicking. That was my phone on the table. I did so well. I nearly the whole episode. Damn. Sorry.
It's all right, Rob. So without further ado, I think it's good night from me.
And I love you too, Tom.
Wow. That's nice to hear, Rob.
and it's good night from him. Bye.
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 Bye.